Hello, everyone. I'm not going to waste any time on giving you a lengthy introduction of Dr. Tharoor, because if you're here this afternoon, you're here only to listen to him. And if you are here only to listen to him, I'm just going to assume that you know something about what he does and who he is. And I'd rather you find the rest out through our conversation. So I'm going to get right to it. And I'm going to start with the title of the talk, Tharoorisms. Now, it's a legit term. Don't you shrug? It's a legit term, and it is a hashtag, of course, and I'm waiting for the Oxford English Dictionary to recognize it. But in the meanwhile, it's going to happen, you know that. But in the meanwhile, I'd like to talk a little bit about the origin story, so to say. It all started with a rather innocent tweet, didn't it?
It wasn't so innocent. I was pretty angry. I mean, there was this really outrageous broadcast by somebody I chose to describe in rage as an unprincipled journalist masquerading, unprincipled showman masquerading as a journalist, in which he had piled on so many lies and innuendos one after the other about me that I felt obliged to react. So I actually just let fly with words that I'd taken for granted everyone knew, and of course they didn't. I said, what did I say? Something like an exasperating farrago of innuendos, misrepresentations, and outright lies broadcast by an unprincipled showman masquerading as a journalist. That was the tweet. And for some reason, that caught the fancy of the Twitterati. And apparently, the Oxford English Dictionary did tweet that the worldwide search for the word farrago apparently suddenly spiked. I mean, it had gone from 102 searches a week to sort of 25 million that day, or some insane figure. And they were moved enough to tweet about it themselves, wondering why this had happened, and particularly from India. So I think that was when it all started. And then people did lots of wonderful memes around it. There was a Captain Haddock of the Tintin comics, saying this instead of billions of blue string particles and so on. So it kind of became all sorts of characters started opening Twitter accounts for themselves, calling themselves Mr. Farrago and versions thereof. So you never know what suddenly, tickles somebody's funny bone. But anyway, it had the desired effect.
Yeah, well, yes, it did. And what I absolutely love about this episode is how you not only took the jokes in your stride, but you also kind of rode the wave, didn't you? And you then started to use the joke to make political points. And I will come to why I love that about the episode, but could you give us a couple of examples of how you did that first?
Well, I mean, there are two examples that do come to mind, but in fact, it was precise. I didn't expect to be saddled with this reputation for using words that people were not familiar with, which is what I ended up being saddled with. So then I did two. One was when a politician who'd been allied with us in the state of Bihar sort of switched overnight. Having campaigned against the BJP in the election, he resigned and formed a coalition with the very party he'd opposed in the election. So I just tweeted, without mentioning his name, but on that particular day, I tweeted the word of the day. I said, snollygoster. I said, translation, a shrewd, unprincipled politician. First usage, the US 1845. Latest usage, and I gave that day's date. So I was able to, if you like, cock a political snook at him without mentioning his name or even seemingly referring to that episode at all. That was one. The other one was, frankly, a slightly shameless piece of book marketing. When my last book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, was done, and it came out just a few months before the elections, and it was very much intended to make an impact, at least on the reading electorate, the reading portions of the electorate. And so one wanted it to get a little more attention than merely announcing that the book was coming out. It had a great cover and a fairly memorable title, so it should have got attention by itself. But I tweeted the jacket with the tweet, the paradoxical prime minister is more than just a 500-page exercise in floccinosis nihilipilification, which, I mean, obviously, it's not a word you use every day, but it's a word I learned in college. It was just one of those fun words you learn because they're so long or so odd. And of course, that then became the talk. And unfortunately, little 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds were made by parents to learn floxy, nosy, nihilipidification. And when I went to my constituency, in particular, large numbers were wheeled out to come and say it to me. But anyway, all of this, I suppose, is what has contributed to the title of the show today. But I mean, obviously, I'm as much poking fun at myself as at anybody else in using words like that. It's simply that I think Salman Rushdie said this about when you wrote the Satanic Verses, that the very things people are cursing you for, even the very words they use to demonize you, you can turn into your assets, and that's something which I think I did with the this undeserved reputation for being a user of unwieldy words.
I think you've done more than that, Shashi, if I may, because we live in times where humor is abjectly absent from political and public discourse. And what's worse is that the way in which you handle this episode is a shining example to my mind of how we don't need to really butcher the language to resort to abuses and words such as secular and libtard to conduct our political debates. Does this, as somebody who loves the language as much as you do, and this doesn't necessarily have to be in English, I think all beautiful languages can be employed to talk with one another and even sort of be caustic with one another for that matter. Does it bother you, this lack of humor and civility and grace and just the absence of vocabulary which takes away from the nuance in public life?
Oh, it bothers me, all right. I think it bothers most people who would value these things. But it may partly be the price we have to pay, both for being in a multilingual polity, which already makes humor awkward territory sometimes, and secondly, for being a democracy in a society which is not necessarily overall as well-educated, as live to nuance and so on, as other democracies tend to be, with the result that the realm of potential misunderstanding is much greater in our situation. I think many of you will remember, the Indians in this hall, the first big controversy, quote unquote, that I got into in my very first few months in politics, when the government declared an austerity drive and a journalist, not entirely innocently, because he's BJP leaning, tweeted to me, "So, Mr. Minister, does this mean you will travel cattle class?" To which I responded, "Yes, in cattle class, out of solidarity with all our holy cows." Now, yeah, thank you. At least some people found it funny. Nobody else in India did. So that. I mean, what happened, as you know, well, actually, as I didn't know initially, because I got onto a plane and went off to Liberia. And in those days, I mean, there was no way to get there. I had to fly, I remember, Delhi to Brussels, wait there, change aircraft, Brussels to Accra, wait there, and fly Accra to Monrovia, during all of which time I was cut off from all communications. We didn't have any means and no one was calling me from home. When I got to Liberia, however, I understood that the dung had hit the fan, and that this expression, which I assumed had been familiar, because first of all, the questioner used the expression. I'd been living in the West for 30 years before that, where it was a very common expression. And therefore, I didn't think cattle class carried any baggage, as it were. But apparently, people in India were not familiar with the expression until I used it. And was promptly translated into Gujarati and Malayalam and Hindi and so on and so forth. And I was being denounced as a snooty elitist who was equating economy class passengers to cattle. And it got so bad that a colleague, my own party, a chief minister, called for my resignation from government on the issue of this. And it actually dominated the front pages of India's papers for 3 days before the Prime Minister pricked the balloon by simply saying, for God's sake, it was only a joke. And that immediately deflated the whole thing. But it was an object lesson in a number of things. Certainly the language issue, the lack of a sense of humor, and the untranslatability of much humor. But also the rightness of something which, frankly, as somebody who had enjoyed Shakespeare in my youth, I ought to have remembered him writing a good 400 years previously, which was that the success of a jest, and I'm quoting Shakespeare's exact words, lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. And that is so true in politics, because in fact, it doesn't really matter what you think you were trying to say and how pure your intentions might have been when you said it. All that matters is what the electorate think they heard. And if a malicious, sensationalist media has helped them to hear the wrong thing, that's not their fault, it's yours for giving them an opportunity, a stick to beat you on the head with. And that obviously resulted in a rather quick drying up of much of my attempts at humor, particularly the kind of easy Stephanian humor from my college days, which involved wordplay and puns and so on, because it was very clear that in the public space in India, I could no longer assume I was merely communicating to people who could get the drift of what I was trying to say.
But that didn't shield you from controversy, did it? Because even when you decided to use a word which was absolutely not used in humor and used correctly, interlocutor, I remember dung hitting the fan, and I couldn't wrap my head around why. So, you know,
Malice is why.
Malice is why.
It was that I was in Saudi Arabia accompanying the Prime Minister, and when the journalist asked me, about the fact that Saudi Arabia is a very good friend of Pakistan's and why were we there to talk to the Saudis, I said, all the more reason why we should talk to them, because it makes them that much more valuable an interlocutor. Now, interlocutor is routine diplomatic pablum, if you like, for the person you're talking to. Right now, you're my interlocutor, and I'm yours. That's all it means. It doesn't mean anything else. But the media willfully chose to misinterpret the statement as suggesting intermediary, and went on to argue that I had upended 50 years of Indian foreign policy with my statement, and that I was suggesting that Saudi Arabia should be an intermediary between us and Pakistan, which of course I had not suggested. The Prime Minister knew I had not suggested it. But the entire Indian coverage of his trip got overshadowed by this. So there's a certain malice behind a lot of this. And the result is that it makes a lot of politicians avoid all risk, retreat from accessibility, from openness, from sharing with the public what's going on. And I think that's also a great pity in a democracy. I think there the media does have something to answer for.
Well, the media has a lot to answer for, and you're being very kind. But you're right in that it is a pity, because politics is also a vehicle of ideas, which is why I believe you joined politics in the first place. But is there, to your mind, still space, and I'm particularly talking about Indian politics at this point in time, for ideas, or do you feel that that space is shrinking, given that ideologies and polarized ideologies, for that matter, have taken center stage, and these ideologies are defining themselves increasingly in a narrow, homogeneous manner? What is the space for ideas in a polity like that?
Well, I was quite flattered when a relatively right-wing publication like Open listed me as the only politician amongst their list of the 50 top public intellectuals in India, and they parked me second, I think, in their list. So it's good to feel that what I've tried to do, to use politics as a realm of ideas, to write, to speak, to argue, and so on, has at least been noticed and appreciated by some, which by all means is a very, very small minority. And in a democracy, particularly in a country like India, numbers matter far more than quality. Each of us MPs, for those of you Brits who don't know that, represent 2 million people on average. I represent 2 million people in Thiruvananthapuram. And so obviously a good 90% of them probably don't read my tweets. 95% probably haven't read my books, even in Malayalam translation. They've all been translated into Malayalam. And for that matter, probably a larger percentage don't read all my articles because they're all over the place, and people have to make an effort to find them, which you can on the internet now, wherever they were originally published, but still. So the result is that you are conscious, first of all, that what you're doing is, for you, a valuable contribution to the political discourse. But at the same time, you're reaching a very, very tiny percentage of the electorate who, by and large, will have no bearing on your electability. And that, to many other friends in politics, limits the utility of this exercise. I mean, why are there so few people doing what I'm doing, and I would, in politics, doing what I'm doing, and I'd say it's not merely because, or it's not certainly not because they're incapable of it. It's simply they've made the judgment that this isn't worth their time. That reaching out to shape the realm of ideas has no bearing on their political success, the degree to which they're valued in their parties, or the clout they command in the public space, let alone in politics. And so they leave it to an idiot like me who, after a long day's work, is willing to sit down at his computer from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. writing, which is what I do most nights, because that's the only time I'm free to write. Otherwise, I'm being assailed by phone calls and messages and visitors all the time. So, I mean, at some point, I too may begin to ask myself, you know, am I sort of burning the candle at both ends to no good purpose? And at that point, I may start slowing down. But for me, this becomes terribly important. I came into politics very late after a 34-year stint abroad, 29 years of which was spent at the United Nations. And to come from a full-fledged career in which I'd risen as high as I could possibly have dreamed, to come into a whole new career and start afresh wasn't easy to begin with. So I'm trying to really make up for lost time in some ways, you know, pack into, you know, now I'm in my 11th year in Parliament, pack into whatever else I may have left in a political career, a lifetime's worth of work, ideas, reflections, and contributions, to leave behind something for my having done this.
You know, I hope you never slow down, because this is one of the things that at least I admire the most about you, which is the fact that you, and also there's been this traditional idea that the technocrat, the statesman, politician is not the, you know, not the politician who wins on the ground, right? And you have defied all kinds of waves or torrents or what they might be, and retained your seat, which I think is fantastic.
Thank you.
And you have also managed to be a prolific writer and a statesman all through, right? And this harks back to the days of people like Nehru, who engaged with ideas at many different levels. But before I talk a little bit more, ask you to talk a little bit more about these choices, I wanted to also ask you that you, like you mentioned, you're not a conventional politician. You have, for one, a real education. You have actual work experience. You don't come from a political family. How hard have the knocks been? Because you make it sound quite easy when you're sitting here, but one knows that it hasn't been, from the outside even, it hasn't quite been that easy. So how hard have the knocks been, and has it been worth it?
I'm still doing it, so I suppose it has been worth it, but it's been very hard. And you know, it's difficult to talk about these things because I belong to a generation that was still brought up never to talk about effort and struggle and pain. You know, the idea is you work very hard, ace your exams, and make it look like it was a breeze. You know, you struggle through the most impossible adversity, but come out of it smiling, and grace under pressure, as it were, was the model. And that's really, I think, I'm not unusual in my generation for having been brought up that way. In today's sort of period of the full-time conventional, confessional media, where everyone is laying bare their soul, I guess it sometimes conveys the wrong impression of either somebody who's blasé about what he's done or is indifferent. It's been a tremendous struggle. I mean, my first year in politics was quite an astonishing experience for me because not only had I had a pretty decent career at the United Nations. I was nominated by India to be the Indian candidate to succeed Kofi Annan as Secretary General, came within 2 votes of making it, failed, came back to India. I'd been used to having a rather fawning and adulatory press every time I'd visited India in my UN days, and suddenly to discover that everything was fine as long as you were living abroad and working in a different field, you were not a threat to anybody in India. The moment you'd come into their space, the claws came out. And it was, for me, something I was completely unprepared for. My back was perforated by the number of stilettos buried deep in it in the course of first few months. My front too, but that's at least as visible. When they come to you from behind, it's more of a challenge. The media was, I mean, they just saw me as apparently as a perfect sort of target to bring down. I couldn't open my mouth and say the most blasé thing. I mean, the most banal things, I beg your pardon, without being somehow finding something whipped up into a controversy, interlocutor being a good example. And the funniest thing is, throughout my UN career, I'd been the one person regularly wheeled out in all the UN organizations I'd served and every position I'd held to face the tough, the uncomfortable media, the hostile questions. I was the only person to do BBC's Hard Talk twice when it was extremely combative. Fox News, I was the one UN official who went on Fox News and dealt with it, because the general reputation I'd had was that I said the right things and I said them the right way. To come to India and suddenly find myself portrayed as anything but that, but somebody whose every other word was grist for the controversy mill or worse, was very hard. And then these completely fake accusations that were sort of shoveled around me because I quite openly supported the idea of an IPL team for Kerala, which in the end was not even for my constituency, because my constituency at that point didn't have a ground eligible for it. But all of that. And finally, at the end of my first year in politics, I actually resigned from government. And that sort of took the heat off a bit. And I was able to sort of catch my breath, rehabilitate myself a little away from the attentions of the media. They'd, breaking news is less exciting. We'd already broken the guy you were trying to. So I was seen as broken. I came down, did my work, attended to my constituency, and came back into government. And then it was in a different position. Then we all know other tragedies struck, which I can't blame on anyone else. It's life. And that then, ours has always been a culture where death unites people across various divisions. I mean, the Montagues would condole the Capulets if somebody had died in either family in India. But in India, in my case, there was, to my astonishment, a section of people, particularly in the media, who chose to exploit my personal tragedy to attack me rather than to mourn with me. So yeah, I've been through an awful lot, and I don't like talking about it much. As I said, I was brought up not to talk about all of these things. At the end of the day, I'm still standing, and what's more, my voters have seen me and have faith in me, and that's ultimately what keeps me going.
Thank you for that, because it definitely deserves applause. I have witnessed what he's talking about firsthand. I was in Kerala in 2014 during the election campaign. I think I interviewed you as well. And it wasn't just the media. There were all kinds of vile pamphlets being distributed by the opposition and so on and so forth. And you stood your ground. You were working day in and day out in those circumstances, and you won. And this is what astonishes me, that your reputation still seems to be that of a sort of an intellectual elite cut off from, and I don't know how many times you'll have to prove over and over again that you are a grassroots leader, because really the proof is in the pudding, and you keep winning despite odds. So my question really is, what makes you not give up? You can go have another career any day you like. What makes you not give up?
Oh, I think I'm done with pursuing careers now. I've been, I had a full-fledged UN career. I've continued to enjoy a career as a writer and a columnist, a public intellectual, whatever you want to call, and now I have a career as a politician as well. And I think that's probably enough careers for a lifetime. So I think I'll stick to this until I run out of steam or the voters run out of patience, all of which are always possible. I always used to joke, and now it suddenly doesn't feel like a joke anymore, that one day the voters may return me to the world of literature. But the fact is that so far that hasn't happened, and there have been good reasons to keep fighting. At some point, a human being runs out of reasons to keep fighting. I haven't reached that point yet. But I've, I think, read enough literature and seen enough of Shakespeare's plays and everything else to know that nothing really lasts forever, including one's own sense of motivation or one's sense of destiny. Self-belief has propelled me so far, and it's still there. But I'm not unintelligent. I'm conscious of the way in which the climate in the country has changed so much. In many ways, the India to which I imagined I was returning is not the India of 2019, which in so many ways has voted for a set of sensibilities and values that I would have regarded as un-Indian had we been talking about this a few years ago. And you know, for 18 books, I have described a certain understanding of what India is all about culturally, the human spirit in India, the values, and the people whom I thought of as the fringe exceptions to my understanding have now become the mainstream and seem to be convincing a larger and ever larger percentage of the public that their way of thinking is the right way of thinking. And to my mind, initially it boggled my mind that people could even think that way in India because, you know, we were all steeped, again, I shouldn't say we, but some of us, and certainly again a generational factor may be coming in, was steeped in if you like, the narrative of the freedom struggle, which was basically that the freedom struggle against the British divided not on ideological grounds. It wasn't Marxist versus capitalists or, you know, socialists versus liberals or whatever. It unfortunately divided on religious grounds. One set of people said religion should be the determinant of nationhood. That was the idea of Pakistan, and they won a country called Pakistan on the basis of religion. And the other set of people said, no, religion cannot be the determinant of nationhood. Our freedom struggle is for everybody. And that was the idea of India. And the India they created and the constitution they wrote over 2.5 years of intense and interesting debate enshrined that idea that here is a country for everybody, equal rights, civil rights, freedom of worship, religion, all of that, as bedrock principles in our constitution. We were not to be, in Nehru's famous phrase, a Hindu Pakistan. Today, when I use that phrase, my own party wants to distance itself from me. That's what's happening in our country. The mainstream climate has now become more and more a mirror of what you know, we used to see as the other, the Pakistani way of looking at polities and societies. So that's, to me, very, very difficult to swallow. Now, I'll continue, you know, keeping the flame alive for what I believe in and what I, as I say, believe India is really all about. But ultimately, it's Indians, the mass of Indians in a democracy, who decide what India is all about. And if they say that my view, Nehru's view, Mahatma Gandhi's view, the view of all the great founders, Ambedkar, Maulana Azad and others, of what India should be, is no longer their view. And in a democracy, they vote for people who espouse a completely different approach. Then it'll be, as I say, a very, very different India. And what is the role of someone like me in a polity that may reflect or mirror that thinking? I don't know. I'm going to give these next 5 years, when we are again in a rather small opposition, my best shot. But I'm making no promises to myself or the world beyond that. We'll have to see.
I want to return to this this question of an alternative idea of India that is emerging. It's always been around, but is obviously emergent at this point in time, and also about your role as a writer in you know, how you see it. But before that, just one more question about your role as a public intellectual and as a political representative, and any sort of clash that might exist between these two roles. Politics is a vehicle of ideas, but politics is also about winning, because that is the ultimate sort of test. And I want to use sort of Shabri Mara as an example to try and ask you how you walk that line. Because clearly, if you talk about equality, as you did in the beginning, you were of the view that women should be allowed into Shabri Mara, and then you went back and considered the view of your constituents who were articulating their idea of sanctity in a more prominent way, and then you kind of went with that. So how do you walk that line, and when does the public intellectual sort of overrule the political representative and vice versa?
Well, as long as I'm in politics, I'm afraid the politician ought to prevail for the most part, but that doesn't mean that the public intellectual doesn't feel it possible to stake out controversial positions. I was the only one to stick his neck out, for example, on Section 377, I tried to move a bill twice to decriminalize homosexuality, which is not a popular position. And both occasions I was shouted down by the BJP. Both times a vote was called and I was completely crushed, and many of my own party members disappeared when the voting was taking place because they didn't want to be seen as supporting the decriminalization of homosexuality. And finally, it had to be the courts that did that because the politicians didn't have the courage to do it. Well, I feel I did the honorable thing by a section of our population that deserved it, and it clearly didn't cost me my election and my constituency, even though I got well-meaning calls from religious leaders saying, "Why are you doing this? We like you. Don't take that away. Don't do this." And I said, well, this is about human beings being denied the same rights that you and I take for granted. And anyway, long story short, I just want to absolve myself of the implicit charge that is coming that I didn't stand up for principle on Shabri Mara. For those of you who've not followed the issue, Shabri Mara is a temple in a forest on a hill. Mala is hill, which has been in existence, it is said, for about 1,000 years, though the most recent version of the temple is only a few decades old. Hindus across southern India, particularly the southern part of the peninsula, so Tamil Nadu, as well as Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and some other southern states come there. It's a fairly arduous climb up, takes you 2.5 hours to climb up from the base, the farthest point you're allowed to go by vehicle, to the top and to offer prayers. Now, it has a peculiar rule, which is tied up with the history of the shrine. The rule is that women of reproductive age, so that's been now arbitrarily defined since 1950 as being women from 10 to 50, may not go into the temple and may not enter the sanctum sanctorum. The myth behind all of this is that the deity Lord Ayyappa, who is worshipped freely by women of all ages in other temples across the state, but in this particular shrine, chose to be in this very difficult forest shrine in order to get away from the world. He took a vow of brahmacharya, celibacy. There was a woman princess, Mallika Puratama, who wanted to marry him, and he said he would not marry, he would not set eyes on any woman of marriageable age until the day that he was ready to marry her, which of course was meant to be never. So all of this around the temple means that no woman of marriageable age or reproductive age was meant to be within sight of the idol. Now, this is a fairly deeply held, entrenched belief, it's been followed. People claim for 1,000 years, others say for somewhat less. It certainly has been breached on a few occasions by either privileged people or people who cocked a snook at the tradition. But for the most part, it has been honored, and the belief in the temple is rather widely, deeply, and strongly held across Kerala in particular and across South India in general. From my childhood, I've seen pilgrims dressing in black, taking various vows for 41 days of the pilgrimage. They don't shave, they abstain from sex, beer, alcohol, cigarettes, women, works, and then they go. And it's a huge, big thing. And the story is much more complicated than this, but this is just by way of background. A Supreme Court petition was filed by a group of people who actually, ironically, all belong to the BJP and the RSS, asking the Supreme Court to declare this practice of keeping women out as unconstitutional. The Supreme Court divided 4-1. It was a 5-member bench. 4 agreed it was unconstitutional because it was violative of the principle of equality, and 1 said that the case, the 1 was the only woman judge out of the 5. She said the case actually should not have been tried on the basis of those principles because religions follow different practices and the religious practice must be respected. Now, when the Supreme Court judgment came, which was in September of 2018, we still have a communist government in power in Kerala. And the communist government, with sort of somewhat unseemly haste, started sort of shoveling women of that age towards the temple. And immediately and initially, entirely spontaneously, protests broke out amongst believers, which the BJP, having instigated the whole trouble, then latched on to realizing it gave them a golden opportunity to stir up Hindu passions on a Hindu issue against the Supreme Court. And they then converted the shrine into a stage for political drama with protests, stone pelting of the police, demonstrations, slogan chanting. The police, foolishly enough, tried to put flak jackets and helmets on two women and take them to the temple and all of that. And you can't imagine how much of a drama it was. Now, when the court judgment first came in, before all these protests broke out, I had quite routinely and predictably, as an instinctive liberal, welcomed the verdict, saying, you know, change comes in various ways, and one way it comes is through the courts. The courts had, after all, just decriminalized homosexuality, and same sort of principle. They're saying this is the way we should go. We should all adjust to it. But when I saw the reactions of my own constituents, it gave me pause. And then I made a systematic effort to try and speak to women of the age that was supposed to benefit from the judgment, women of reproductive age or marriageable age, as how they felt about the judgment. And obviously it's a very unrepresentative sample, the people I could meet and speak to, but literally I couldn't come across a single woman out of the hundreds I spoke to who applauded the judgment. They all said this was, they felt kicked in the vitals by something like this, that there was an interference with their faith. But I said, wouldn't you like to go? They said, certainly not, because we believe in the legend of Lord Ayyappa, and we believe to go there would violate our faith in him, because he would actually be offended to see us. So we'll wait. We are ready to wait. That was the catchphrase that many of them attached themselves to. And when I realized this, I began rethinking it. And then the more I thought, the more I read, the more I realized that I had actually framed the issue wrongly as purely an issue of equality. But if I framed the same debate as one of sanctity, it became a totally different answer. And after a month of silence, while all this was raging, I came out with a position which disappointed all my liberal friends, and I'm still denounced regularly from every liberal pulpit, saying that, no, I think on this one, the Supreme Court was wrong. And I'll give you one obvious example. In any Western democracy, you can't start a club or an institution or a private organization and say that only men can be office bearers in it. But the Catholic Church can quite rightly say that only priests, that only men can be priests and bishops. Why? Because the church is assumed to have a different set of rules from the rest of civil society. That's the logic that should have been applied to Shabri Mara as well. And indeed, there are other temples with other gender restrictions, including a handful of temples in India, 8, I think, where men are not allowed into the sanctum sanctorum, the goddess, some goddess temples. Anyway, to cut a long story short, that was the bottom line of this. Now, I've been accused of political opportunism, and I don't blame people for saying that. Certainly, the fact that I took the stand I did would have helped me with my own electorate. But the fact is that my electorate are the people whose voice I have to represent in Parliament. Why would I take the side of some unelected Supreme Court justices who saw an issue in one way, rather than those of the very flesh and blood people whose interests I'm supposed to represent? So that's the long answer to this short question.
For what it's worth, this was not some kind of subterfuge to level any charges on you. I do think it's a very, very complex debate, and where equality and sanctity are concerned. So this was a genuine example that I was trying to use for you to kind of delineate these issues. We have, I believe, just 5 minutes, and I was really keen on asking you the language question, the English versus, whether or not we should have a universal language in India, the Hindi imposition, and so on and so forth. But because we have like a couple of minutes left, sorry? For questions, yeah, for sure. I'm going to, because the 2019 elections have just happened, ask you a couple of questions about your take on the elections. Now, this was a sort of very presidential election, but Congress seems to have lost both in terms of the idea of India and leadership, right? What do you make of this loss? And of course, Kerala has emerged as some, strange outlier to this trend. So A, what do you make of this? And I'm going to club one or two questions together. Second, what happens in the aftermath of it? What is the lead? I still don't quite know. I follow the news ardently. Is Rahul Gandhi still the president of Congress or not? I would love to know that answer. And finally, and I'm just putting this into a, you were in Jaipur in January, and you seem to believe, like a lot of us did, that the BJP cannot possibly best its numbers from 2014. So you seem to think that Hindu Rashtra is not really something that's coming for us. But in the light of these elections, what do you make of the future of India?
I'm utterly taken aback. And I have to say that I was wrong, like many, many others. Even in my political pundit hat, my observer, commentator hat, apart from being personally engaged in the outcome, I genuinely, looking around the country, didn't think the BJP had a prayer. I thought that they would be down to between 160 and 180 seats in the best case scenario for them, and that their allies might contribute at best another 40, and they'd fall well short of the majority in parliament. They'd not be able to find other allies, whereas we, with comparable numbers, would have been able to find the allies needed to take us over the top. So I was expecting that outcome. I think a couple of things. One of the most startling things was that Indian voters chose not to vote in their economic self-interest. I mean, we have a disaster in the economy. The unemployment levels are at a 45-year high. Exports are down, industrial production is down, manufacturing is stagnating. Extortionate taxes on fuel and petrol have meant that while when petrol prices dropped everywhere else in the world, they went up in India. There was almost no reason, one would have thought, for anyone to vote for the BJP if they were thinking of their wallet. And also, why would a young man who 5 years ago voted for the BJP in the expectation that he'd be getting a job in this new economy Mr. Modi was talking about, why would he vote for Mr. Modi when he still didn't have a job? Well, I was wrong. And the question of what makes the Indian voter vote is something that I'm sure psephologists and political scientists are going to have a field day studying, because clearly a number of factors came up, the whole national security argument because of that terrorist attack in Pulwama, and the muscle flexing in Balakot, which in fact was ineffective but served the purpose of being able to be used in the election. The leadership message that Mr. Modi is the only one who can keep us safe. He's a strong, muscular figure with his 56-inch chest, that he's going to protect the nation. His tailor has confessed that the measurement should be 50, but he does say 56, so we will take that on advisement. And finally, the fact that where the macroeconomy failed, some of the micro things got done. So there was this distribution of gas cylinders, there was construction of toilets in villages. Now, 65% of the toilets don't have running water and can't be used. 90-odd% of the gas cylinders haven't been renewed because people can't afford the refills. Yet, because something was done, there was the perception that the BJP is delivering. And so the average person in rural India, in the Hindi heartland, didn't worry about the macroeconomy, wasn't at the unemployment exchanges looking for a job, was more inclined to be impressed by the toilet and the gas cylinder than perhaps political pundits gave him credit for. So I would say these three factors combined would answer your question. As to Rahul Gandhi, I think that he's still the president of the party. He has offered his resignation. It's not been accepted by the highest decision-making body of the party, the working committee. So my assumption, therefore, is that he remains. But there is a question about, whether he's going to come and assert himself in that role, which we'll probably know Monday morning when he is due in Delhi for Parliament.
Well, perhaps we could have asked him. He's supposed to be somewhere around in London. I mean,
I heard he's on his way back to.
All right. But finally, very quickly, future of India, because you were talking very sort of passionately about the idea of India and the emergent versus the emergent idea of India. What do you see happening over the next 5 years?
Well, I still am a great believer in India. I mean, I just think it's an extraordinary place. We are 1/6 of humanity. So whether the world likes it or not, what India does and what Indians do will ultimately have echoes and resonance around the world. I think it's very important to continue the process of freeing up the creative energies of the Indian people that began with the liberalization of 1991. So we've had a generation to see that progress, and a lot of it has been wonderful and applause-worthy. The only thing I worry about is the the harmony and social cohesiveness of a society in which we had lived with pluralism for so long that any attempt to, I even once wrote a line in one of my books, I think it was India from Midnight to the Millennium, that the singular thing about India is that you can only speak of it in the plural. Now, how does that line stand up against this homogenizing attempt by those who are ruling us today to reshape an India on the slogan of Hindutva, Hindustan? That idea is, to me, foreign to the very spirit of the India I've celebrated all my life. And that's the one area of worry that I have, that will the divisions engendered by that point of view undermine and tear away the great potential that India has for being in every other way an extraordinary shining example for the rest of the world.
That's not exactly a very positive note to end our conversation on, but we will be taking questions from the audience. Is there somebody around with a mic? The lady here, please. May I, just before you start, may I request that you keep your questions short and keep them as questions and not comments, please? I'd really appreciate that because there are lots of questions and very little time.
So, Shashi, do you think that, any nation in its integrity as a nation, is it defined by real or perceived threats to its integrity and to its identity? I think this recent thing that we are seeing in India right now, this whole idea of we are, unapologetically a majority Hindu nation, I think it's arising out of certain things that are going on in the country, and some things that are also just being perceived from outside. And I think that's what the BJP wave has also ridden that kind of, that momentum or that dynamic that's been going on in India. So, is there really an enemy? Is there really an enemy? Is there really a threat to Indian integrity that you see anywhere?
I'm Hindu myself. I've written a book called Why I'm a Hindu, which is available in the UK, and which talks about my understanding of my faith. That's a faith that rests on a basic principle of acceptance of difference. Ekam sat viprabhavada vadanti, one truth, but sages call it by different names. Vasudeva Kutambakam, the world is one family. These tenets and principles are completely accommodative of difference. Unfortunately, the Hindutva ideology departs from Hinduism in this respect because it is intolerant towards Islam and Christianity, and particularly to Islam, for reasons that have nothing to do with either Hinduism or Hindu faith or Hindu spiritual texts, but all to do with historical resentments, sort of chip on the shoulder that have been stoked by a certain interpretation of cultural memory relating to Muslim invasions of India in the past and all of these things. And that chip on the shoulder, I'm afraid, is creating the kind of situation that we've seen, resulting in episodes of lynching of individuals, cow vigilantism, the intolerance. So I would argue with you that if you're saying, so what's wrong if India asserts its natural Hinduism, I would say then define that Hinduism for me. If it's Hinduism that's inclusive, that accepts everybody around it, that is totally accommodative and pluralist, then I have no problem. I've actually argued again in the same book I cited 20 years ago, India from Midnight to the Millennium, that one of the reasons India is secular is because it's Hindu. It's not secular in the Western sense of the term of keeping away from religion, but secular in the sense of allowing all religions to flourish, because that is the Hindu belief. But if you talk about Hindutva, I don't think it's the same thing. That's it. So we've seen too many, sadly,
here in front,
incidents.
please, and then we'll take some questions from the back as well.
Shashi ji, you've bemoaned the loss of pluralistic belief, etc., in India, and Rahul Gandhi has unfortunately completely failed at presenting the belief that you have in India in the last two elections. When can we see you taking over the country and setting it to rights?
It doesn't work that way, and I think those who know Indian politics will tell you that it doesn't work that way. We don't have mechanisms. Parties really have established leadership structures. There's no real way of emerging from within. So I'll be very blunt and say that I don't think that's on the cards. We live with the structures we've got. And all we can try and do is do our very best to make a difference within what's made possible to us. It's not like the British parliamentary system where we've seen prime ministers stepping down and a number of people coming forward and presenting their case to be anointed the next leader. And all of that is not there in India. It's just not the system, unfortunately.
But if Congress is not succeeding, isn't it the members of Congress, it's their duty to put forward the person?
Well, I think the one thing that the Congress members all seem to agree on, or almost everybody universally agrees on, is the value to them of the continued leadership of Rahul Gandhi and the Gandhi-Nehru family at the top of the party. So that's indeed, I mean, if there was a free and fair election a la Westminster within the Congress workers or the Congress MPs, Rahul Gandhi would win in a canter anyway. So that is the reality, and I think that's, I'm comfortable with that reality. I think what I want to do is make a difference, play my part within that reality.
At the back, please. Over there. The gentleman.
Hi, I'm from Pakistan, and I've been a lot on mainstream Indian media for what they call debates. And whilst I've tried a lot to find a common bridge, as a liberal voice from Pakistan, I've found that there is hardly any room for dissent on mainstream media. Would you also, concur with me on this, that there's lack of pluralism of views on mainstream media, and would that open room for more of social media now? Thank you.
It really wasn't always the case. In fact, I think many of us recall that right up to the first decade of the century, the frequent voices from very prominent, well-known names in India arguing for peace with Pakistan, arguing against a hawkish policy and so on. I think, frankly, India ran out of patience with terrorism. It's as simple as that. It was the repeated, frequent terrorist assaults. Every time there was a gesture of peace from the Indian side, it got matched by an ISI-sponsored terror attack. And the most famous was the extraordinary decision of the previous BJP Prime Minister Vajpayee in '99 to take a bus to Lahore, undoing his entire lifetime of hawkishness on Pakistan, to make a speech at the Minar-e-Pakistan, and they hailed the Lahore spirit. And 3 months later, the Pakistani military sends soldiers across to capture the heights in Kargil. And that kind of one betrayal after the other has diminished considerably the constituency for peace. I am, unfortunately, regularly demonized myself for not being as hawkish as the mainstream media wants me to be on Pakistan. And right now, we're going to have a session at 5:30 talking about cricket, with the match between India and Pakistan looming tomorrow. I fear that rather than bringing out all the sporting camaraderie we like to celebrate, it may bring out the worst in both our societies. And that is, to my mind, somewhat regrettable. So to that degree, I would agree with you that there is far less plurality of opinion on Pakistan. But honestly, even as somebody who started off as a dove myself, I do feel like a dove who's been mugged by reality. I just don't think, honestly, that there can be much of a constituency for peace in Pakistan until and unless we see genuine action by some people with clout in Pakistan against the perpetrators of terror. When you're seeing them running around loose, making speeches, sharing stages with those in power, when you're seeing the helplessness of the civilian authorities to keep their word in any agreement they make with the civilian government in India, then after a while people say, what's the point? This is endemic. The fact is that in a country like ours, the state has an army. In Pakistan, the army has a state. And as long as the army doesn't want peace because it's not in its interest, then there will not be peace, and there's no point us talking about it. That is the broad Indian consensus today, which was not the case, let's say, up to 1999. That's what's happened. And so it can be changed, but it will only be changed by Pakistan, by Pakistan's own behavior.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now is, we have very little time. I'm going to take a bunch of questions and let Dr. Tharoor decide what he wants to respond to.
This gentleman had his hand up first of everyone, I think.
Oh, sorry to have missed you. We'll take a question from you here.
Thank you, Shashi, for noticing that. Inglorious Empire, then Paradoxical Prime Minister. Can we expect reluctant dynast from you, or political consideration would be too heavy for that?
Sorry, I didn't quite fully hear that. Did you?
I'll repeat that once we've taken a bunch of questions for you. The lady over there and then the gentleman over there, please.
Hi. My question is regarding your own experience in Indian politics. You said that you faced a lot of hostility from the mainstream media. My question is basically, is it about yourself, like Shashi Tharoor, the person, or is it about Shashi Tharoor, the symbol of Western modernity, which had to face this kind of resistance that you had faced from Indian media, if you think about it, and a person like you who symbolizes a very different modernity from what India thinks about modernity, would always have this kind of experience, who enters into politics?
The gentleman over there, please.
You have treaded a very difficult path. You are an intellectual, but you are also trying to be a politician. So my question to you is, like you, I was quite surprised by the election results that the Indian voters have voted against their economic interest. I thought Indians are more like the Americans. It is the economy, stupid. So I was quite surprised, like you. But the fact that they did vote for the 56-inch chest or whatever, there must be something real in it. Can you just dismiss all this as a hype or an artifact? There must be some substance. So my question to you is, as an intellectual, what's your analysis? What is real in it, for which India badly needs, and so which can help probably the politicians adapt their strategy to meet their real needs?
Thank you. One more question. The lady over there, please.
I just wanted to ask about something we touched upon earlier, which was the role of humor in public discourse. That's what we started with. One of your earliest books is one of my favorite, the great Indian novel, Great Tale of Allegory. Can we ever see you returning to humor in writing? Or is life too grim for that?
What the gentleman was asking was, can we expect a book on the reluctant dynast from you in the future? So starting with that, or whichever way you want to take it.
Well, I mean, no, that's not a subject that I plan to write about. And going back to the lady as well, I mean, satire was a privilege of somebody who could maintain a certain distance from the things he was writing about. Today I am, whether I like it or not, an actor in the very political space that I would be satirizing. And I'm not sure that's possible. I mean, there have been other politicians who published books, but they've usually been books which are either an extension of their political persona, or in a case like Douglas Hurd in this country, have nothing whatsoever to do. He wrote murder mysteries on the side, you know. But I think you can't write effectively about something of which you are a part until you've acquired distance from it. So if one day, as I was joking earlier, the voters do return me to the world of literature, or I take a decision at the end that I'm done with the struggle and that I see no point in continuing, which is not something I'm inclined to think I might feel, but who knows what India 5 years from now will present as its options to me, then I would like to go back to fiction, and why not satire perhaps. But there are lots of themes that have been bubbling away in my head. It's just that my life hasn't allowed me to write everything I would have wanted to write. And I do believe that when you're in a serious, demanding profession in public life, that your first obligation is to that and to the voters who've entrusted their well-being to you. So writing has always been something I've done afterwards when I could find the time, and always only when I could. So for all of those reasons, I think that both of you will have to wait a bit for any books that along the lines you like. I didn't fully catch the question about why I was being targeted. Was that the issue? I'm sorry, I'm having slight audibility issues. The lady said, is it me personally as an individual, or
you as a symbol of Western modernity?
That's, I think, both, actually, because I don't see myself as much of a symbol of Western modernity, because I actually, I mean, the English for which I'm excoriated, I learned in India. I mean, I was born in London, but I grew up in India from the age of two and a half. And I learned India from Indian teachers. I learned English from Indian teachers. I just happened to have a good year. And back in the 60s in the schools I went to, this is the way you were taught to speak. And I did it better, partly because also my parents themselves being migrants, as it were, away from Canada, there was no overwhelming Indian language at home that would have otherwise inflected my English. And so English became, for me, my sisters, and many others like me in urban India, of parents who moved around, their natural first language. So I didn't think of it as Western. I thought of it as quintessentially an urban Indian phenomenon of the later 20th century. But you're right, for many, this is it. And I'm told that in some of the discussions that came up after the defeat about potential sort of leaders and so on and so forth, that the argument being used against me was that I couldn't possibly be considered because I have no mass appeal. Well, I've won 3 elections, for God's sake, but apparently that's not good enough, because mass appeal requires you to speak demotic Hindi and to be able to be more comfortable in that than in any other language or form. And I can't apologize for being who I am. The world has changed, and I've perhaps not changed enough with it. Mind you, I have given interviews in Hindi to Aapki Adalat and this and that, but the lady is right that both factors do come against me. And finally, there's one question I haven't answered. Yes, but I think in some ways I have answered it, because I tried to explain the factors that I would, as an observer, ascribe to why people didn't vote in their economic self-interest, the larger-than-life image of Mr. Modi, the national security issue, which was drummed up and played to perfection at the right time just before the elections, and the sort of success of the micro projects that reach people directly, toilets in villages, gas cylinders and kitchens and so on, that many people felt they were getting benefits, even if those seemed to be benefits that had very many important riders attached. Now, what does that teach the rest of us? Well, it teaches us that the BJP, having attacked the Congress for what it called welfareism and povertarianism and all of this stuff, has actually taken the leaf out of our playbook and actually successfully delivered some welfare schemes, perhaps more effectively than we thought they might have done. And therefore, in many ways, it has reaffirmed the consensus that what the majority of Indian voters want is a government that does them favors that improve the quality of their daily lives. Conducting a democracy in a developing country with large numbers of people still living in poverty and under a poverty line that's been drawn barely this side of the funeral pyre is a totally different set of calculations from the kind of the theories of the IMF economists and so on about what's good for a society. The BJP is going to be straddling this uneasy divide between its openness to the outside world and foreign investment, which the government keeps touting as the only remedy for the macroeconomy, and its great need to deliver benefits at the bottom, at the microeconomy, in order to win re-election. And I think you'll see that tension play out in the next 5 years. If they handle it well, good for them. That would presumably be what the Indian vote is looking for.
Well, I would certainly love to listen to Dr. Tharoor for a while more, and I don't know about you, but unfortunately we're all out of time. He will be signing books right outside this auditorium, I'm reliably told. Is that correct?
Where exactly?
It's right outside.
Outside there,
Okay.
The bar area.
So you heard that. Well, the bar area, get yourself drinks, get your book signed, and perhaps he'll answer a couple more questions if he's in the mood. Thank you for listening to us, and thank you, Dr. Tharoor. That was great. Thank you.